The Boeing 737 shuddered through turbulence at 37,000 feet, its passengers oblivious to the growing crisis unfolding in cockpits across the eastern seaboard. In row 18, seat C, Lieutenant Colonel Vera Blackbird Kowalski slept with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to catch rest wherever possible. Her worn leather jacket bore no insignia, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. To the businessman beside her, she looked like any other tired traveler heading home from a conference. What he couldn't see were the calloused hands that had gripped the stick of an F-16 through 3 combat deployments, the faint scar along her jawline from ejecting over hostile territory in Afghanistan, the way her breathing remained controlled even in sleep, a testament to years of high-altitude training where oxygen was precious and panic was death. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, unusually tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties with our navigation systems. If there are any commercial or military pilots aboard, please identify yourselves to the flight attendants immediately." Vera's eyes snapped open. 23 years in the Air Force had trained her to recognize the subtle notes of controlled fear in a pilot's voice. This wasn't mechanical failure. The businessman shifted nervously as she unbuckled her seatbelt, noting how her movements carried a predatory precision that seemed at odds with her civilian clothes. "Ma'am, the captain needs to see you," the flight attendant whispered, her face pale. As Vera moved toward the cockpit, she caught fragments of hushed conversations from other passengers. Something about radio blackouts, military frequencies going silent, the kind of whispers that preceded either very good news or catastrophic bad news. The cockpit door opened to reveal Captain Morrison, a silver-haired veteran of commercial aviation, and his younger co-pilot, both staring at instrument panels that should have been alive with data, but now showed only static. Morrison's eyes swept over Vera's unremarkable appearance with barely concealed skepticism. "You the pilot?" he asked, his tone suggesting he'd expected someone different. Someone male, perhaps, someone who looked the part. "Lieutenant Colonel Vera Kowalski, United States Air Force," she replied, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. "Retired as of last week." The co-pilot snorted. "Great, a desk jockey." Vera's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air. 23 years of proving herself to men who thought call signs were earned through politics rather than skill had taught her patience. She'd let her competence do the talking, as it always had. "What's your situation, Captain?" Morrison gestured at the dead instruments. "Complete navigation failure 30 minutes ago. Radios picking up nothing but emergency frequencies, and what we're hearing—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Ma'am, I think we might be at war." Captain Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the communication panel, where static punctuated by fragmented military transmissions painted a picture of chaos. Vera leaned forward, her trained ear parsing the scattered voices that spoke in the coded language of crisis. Words like DEFCON and multiple contacts and all commercial traffic drifted through the electromagnetic soup. "How long since you've had contact with air traffic control?" she asked, her fingers already moving across the radio controls with the muscle memory of 1,000 training hours. 47 minutes, the co-pilot replied, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by something approaching respect as he watched her work. Last transmission was vectors to Boston Logan. Then, nothing. Vera tuned through frequencies with surgical precision, each adjustment revealing new layers of the unfolding situation. Military emergency channels buzzed with activity, but civilian frequencies remained eerily silent. She'd heard this particular symphony of radio signatures before, during exercises that simulated the unthinkable. "Sir," she said, turning to Morrison, "I need you to understand something. Based on what I'm hearing, every commercial aircraft in the Eastern Corridor is likely experiencing the same blackout. GPS is down. Navigation beacons are offline. Someone has effectively blinded civilian aviation. The captain's face went white. Terrorists. Worse. Vera's voice remained steady, but her knuckles had gone pale where they gripped the radio. This is coordinated electronic warfare, military-grade jamming across multiple spectrums, the kind of capability that belongs to nation-states, not terror cells. Behind them, the cockpit door opened as curious passengers tried to peer inside. The flight attendant, a composed woman named Patricia, gently but firmly guided them back to their seats while keeping her ears tuned to the conversation unfolding in the confined space. Morrison stared at his instruments as if willing them back to life. So what do we do? We've got 237 souls on board and maybe 3 hours of fuel. Vera studied the backup compass, one of the few instruments still functioning reliably. We navigate the old-fashioned way, dead reckoning, celestial if we have to, but first, we need to understand what we're flying into. She continued working the radio, her movements economical and purposeful. Years of combat flying had taught her that panic was a luxury fighter pilots couldn't afford. In the cramped cockpit of an F-16 screaming through hostile airspace, there was only the mission, the aircraft, and the training that kept you alive long enough to complete both. A burst of clear transmission cut through the static. All civilian aircraft, this is NORAD. Maintain current headings. Do not deviate from assigned altitudes. Military escort inbound for all commercial traffic. The three pilots exchanged glances. Military escort meant the threat was real, immediate, and significant enough to mobilize fighter interceptors. Vera felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling across her shoulders like a well-worn flight suit. "Captain," she said quietly, "with your permission, I'd like to take the co-pilot's seat." Morrison nodded without hesitation. The co-pilot, whose name tag read JENSCN, moved aside with surprising grace. As Vera settled into the right seat, her hands found the controls with instinctive familiarity. The Boeing 737's controls felt foreign under Vera's hands after years in fighter cockpits, but the fundamental principles remained unchanged: altitude, attitude, and airspeed. The holy trinity that kept aluminum and human flesh suspended impossibly in the thin air miles above Earth. She adjusted her seat, familiarizing herself with the instrument layout while maintaining the professional calm that had earned her the call sign Blackbird during her first deployment over Iraq. "Blackbird?" Jensen asked, nodding the patch on her jacket that had been hidden beneath her seatbelt. "As in SR-71. As in the bird that sees everything and strikes without warning," Morrison said, his voice carrying newfound respect. "I've heard that call sign before. You flew combat air patrol during the Tehran crisis." Vera nodded once, her attention focused on the primary flight display. The Tehran crisis, 3 weeks of aerial chess with Iranian fighters testing American resolve, where one miscalculation could have triggered regional war. She'd logged 47 hours of combat time during those tense weeks, her F-16 a sentinel in hostile skies. "Contact bearing 270, Angels 20, crackled through the radio. Military terminology for aircraft at 20,000 feet, approaching from the west. Vera's training kicked in automatically, her eyes scanning the horizon for the telltale glint of sunlight on metal. "There," she pointed, directing Morrison's attention to 2 distant specks growing larger against the afternoon sky. F-22 Raptors. Twin-engine configuration, angular stealth profile. They're here to escort us." The lead fighter pulled alongside their starboard wing, close enough that Vera could see the pilot's helmet through the canopy. A subtle hand gesture, 2 fingers pointed forward, indicated they should maintain heading and speed. Standard intercept protocol, though the Raptor pilot's presence this close to civilian traffic suggested the situation had escalated beyond routine. "Shamrock Flight, this is Sword 11, came the crisp voice of the fighter pilot. "Maintain present course and altitude. You're being vectored to alternate landing facility. Acknowledge." Morrison keyed the microphone. "Sword 1-1, Shamrock flight acknowledges. Request destination and nature of emergency." A long pause filled the cockpit, punctuated only by the steady hum of turbofan engines and the whisper of air across the aircraft's skin. When the fighter pilot's voice returned, it carried the weight of classified information being carefully parsed. "Shamrock, multiple airspace incursions detected along eastern seaboard. All commercial traffic being diverted to secure facilities for passenger screening and aircraft inspection. Estimate 40 minutes to alternate field." Vera caught Morrison's eye and shook her head slightly. The official explanation was sanitized military speak, designed to calm civilian nerves while revealing nothing of substance. In her experience, when fighter escorts were deployed for passenger screening, the actual threat was significantly more serious than anyone wanted to admit publicly. She keyed the intercom to address their passengers, her voice projecting the confidence that had once steadied nervous wingmen in hostile airspace. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Lieutenant Colonel Kowalski. We're being escorted to an alternate airport as a precautionary measure." The radio crackled again, drawing her attention back to the unfolding crisis that stretched far beyond their aircraft's aluminum walls. Below their aircraft, the familiar patchwork of suburban America scrolled past like a detailed map, each town and highway a landmark in what Vera now recognized as potentially the opening moves of something unprecedented in American airspace. The second F-22 had taken position off their port wing, the two Raptors maintaining perfect formation with the casual precision that marked America's most elite pilots. "Shamrock flight, be advised your destination is McGuire Air Force Base," came the updated transmission from Sword 1-1. "Runway 24 left is cleared for your approach. Ground personnel will provide passenger disembarkation procedures." McGuire. Vera knew the base well, a joint facility that handled both military and emergency civilian operations. More significantly, it housed specialized units trained in exactly the kind of crisis response that required military escorts for commercial aircraft. The choice of destination confirmed her growing suspicions about the scope of whatever was unfolding. Morrison's hands moved across the controls with the steady competence of 30 years in commercial aviation, but Vera noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes lingered on instruments that should have been providing navigation data, but remained frustratingly dark. She'd seen the same body language in bomber pilots approaching heavily defended targets, professional calm masking very real concern. "Colonel," Jensen said quietly, "in your military experience, how often do they scramble fighters for civilian aircraft?" "Almost never," Vera replied, her eyes tracking the lead Raptor's position relative to their starboard engine. "And when they do, it's because something significant enough to threaten national security is already in motion." The cockpit fell silent except for the constant whisper of radio chatter from military frequencies. Vera continued monitoring the transmissions, her trained ear picking up fragments that painted an increasingly concerning picture. References to multiple vectors, coordinated timing, and package delivery suggested this wasn't a single incident but part of a larger, orchestrated operation. Patricia appeared at the cockpit door again, her professional composure intact but stress evident in the tight lines around her eyes. "Colonel, some passengers are asking questions about the fighter jets. They're getting nervous." Vera nodded, understanding the delicate balance required to maintain calm while acknowledging reality. "Tell them the escorts are routine procedure during navigation equipment failures," which is technically true. As Patricia returned to the passenger cabin, Vera found herself thinking about the sleeping woman she'd been just 2 hours ago. Lieutenant Colonel Vera Kowalski, retired after 23 years of service, heading home to start the civilian career everyone assured her would be fulfilling. The transition briefings had covered everything from resume writing to pension benefits, but somehow neglected to mention that some kinds of service never truly ended. Shamrock Flight, begin descent to flight level 200. Contact Maguire approach on frequency 327.4. The steady loss of altitude marked their entry into what military planners called the engagement envelope, the airspace where aircraft became vulnerable to ground-based threats and where fighter escorts earned their keep. Through the windscreen, the eastern seaboard spread before them like a vast strategic map, dotted with cities and installations that represented both America's strength and its potential vulnerabilities. Vieira had studied similar maps in briefing rooms around the world, but never from this perspective, as a civilian caught in the crosshairs of events beyond her control. The approach to Maguire Air Force Base revealed the true scope of the crisis unfolding across American skies. As their Boeing 737 descended through 15,000 feet, Vieira counted at least 12 other commercial aircraft in various stages of approach and landing. Delta, United, American, Southwest. All the familiar liveries of domestic aviation now clustered at a military installation that typically saw only cargo flights and training operations. "Jesus," Morrison whispered, his voice carrying the awe of someone witnessing history. "How many planes are they diverting?" "All of them, by the look of it," Vieira replied, her pilot's eye automatically calculating spacing and approach vectors for the traffic converging on Maguire's parallel runways. The choreographed chaos reminded her of wartime operations, when bases transformed overnight from routine training facilities into staging areas for global operations. The lead F-22 waggled its wings, a time-honored aviation farewell, before peeling away with its wingman, their mission complete now that Shamrock Flight was safely within Maguire's protected airspace. Vieira watched the Raptors climb steeply into the afternoon sun, their sleek forms disappearing into the blue like deadly spirits returning to whatever ethereal realm spawned America's most advanced fighters. "Maguire approach, Shamrock Flight with you, flight level 150, inbound for runway 24 left," Morrison transmitted, his voice carrying the crisp professionalism that civilian pilots maintained even in extraordinary circumstances. "Shamrock Flight, Maguire approach. Cleared for visual approach runway 24 left. Be advised, ground personnel will marshal you to designated parking area. Shut down engines upon parking and await further instructions." The formal language of air traffic control couldn't mask the underlying tension. "Await further instructions" was military speak for something significant is happening, and we need time to figure out what comes next. As they descended through 10,000 feet, Vieira could see Maguire's main terminal building surrounded by buses, military vehicles, and what appeared to be mobile command posts. The base had transformed into a processing center for thousands of displaced passengers, each aircraft representing hundreds of lives suddenly caught in the machinery of national security response. "Ladies and gentlemen from the flight deck," Morrison announced over the cabin intercom, "we're beginning our final approach to Maguire Air Force Base in New Jersey. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright position." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Upon landing, military personnel will provide instructions for deplaning and temporary accommodations. We appreciate your patience during this unusual situation." Vieira listened to the announcement while monitoring approach frequencies, where a constant stream of diversions painted a picture of unprecedented disruption to American aviation. Airlines that normally competed fiercely for market share now shared military ramps, their aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip under the watchful eye of armed security personnel. The runway threshold passed beneath their landing gear with the familiar thump of rubber meeting concrete, followed by the reverse thrust that slowed 237 souls to taxi speed. "Welcome to Maguire Air Force Base," Morrison said quietly, his hands moving across shutdown checklists with the mechanical precision of completed routine. But as Vera looked out at the organized chaos surrounding them, she knew this was anything but routine. The engines spun down to silence as ground personnel in military fatigues guided their aircraft to a parking spot between a Southwest 737 and a United widebody, the unusual airline congregation creating a surreal tableau against McGuire's utilitarian military infrastructure. Vera watched through the cockpit window as buses approached their position, the standardized efficiency of military logistics already organizing what could have been chaos into manageable streams of human movement. Shamrock crew, remain in cockpit for security debriefing, crackled the ground control frequency. Passengers will be processed through Mobile Screening Facility Alpha. Morrison looked at Vera with the expression of someone realizing his worst fears about the situation were being confirmed. Security debriefings weren't conducted for mechanical failures or routine diversions. They were conducted when authorities suspected something more serious had precipitated the widespread grounding of civilian aviation. Through the passenger cabin windows, Vera could see families gathering their belongings with the bewildered compliance of people thrust into circumstances beyond their understanding. Children pressed faces against windows, fascinated by the military vehicles and personnel that populated this unfamiliar world. Parents maintained cheerful facades, while their eyes reflected the growing concern that came with incomplete information and official euphemisms. Patricia appeared at the cockpit door one final time. "Colonel, several passengers have been asking specifically for you. They want to know if you think this is serious." Vera considered her response carefully. 23 years of military service had taught her that leadership sometimes meant acknowledging uncertainty while projecting confidence. The balance was delicate. Too much reassurance bred complacency, while too much honesty could trigger panic. "Tell them we're in good hands," she said finally. "McGuire has some of the finest security and logistics personnel in the Air Force. Whatever this is, we're at one of the safest places we could be." It was true, as far as it went. McGuire Air Force Base represented American military capability at its most sophisticated, trained personnel, advanced equipment, and protocols designed to handle exactly these kinds of contingencies. What she didn't say was that the deployment of such capabilities suggested the contingency was significant enough to warrant them. As passengers began filing off the aircraft, Vera caught fragments of their conversations, speculation about terrorism, technical failures, government exercises gone wrong. The human need to construct explanations for the inexplicable created dozens of theories, some more plausible than others. In her experience, the truth was usually both simpler and more complex than civilian imagination could conjure. A knock on the cockpit door announced the arrival of their military escort, a young Air Force captain whose crisp uniform and serious demeanor suggested this was neither routine nor exercise. His nameplate read TORRES, and his eyes carried the alertness of someone briefed on classified information. "Gentlemen, ma'am," he said with professional courtesy, "if you could accompany me to the operations center, we have some questions about your flight profile and any unusual observations." As they gathered their belongings and prepared to step into whatever awaited beyond the aircraft's familiar aluminum cocoon, Vera felt the weight of transition, from passenger to participant in events that would likely reshape American aviation security for years to come. The operations center occupied what had once been a routine briefing room, but now hummed with the controlled intensity of a crisis management hub. Banks of monitors displayed radar sweeps, flight tracking data, and communication logs, while personnel in both military uniforms and civilian suits huddled around workstations that painted real-time pictures of American airspace in unprecedented detail. Captain Torres gestured them toward a conference table where a distinguished Air Force colonel and a woman in a dark suit waited with the patient alertness of professional interrogators. The colonel's nameplate read Harrison, and his chest displayed the wings and ribbons of a career pilot. The civilian's credentials remained diplomatically concealed, but her bearing suggested federal law enforcement or intelligence services. "Captain Morrison, crew of Shamrock Flight," Colonel Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. "I'm Colonel Harrison, base commander. This is Special Agent Chen from the Department of Homeland Security. We need to understand exactly what you observed during your flight." Morrison recounted the timeline: navigation failure, radio blackouts, the gradual realization that their situation was neither unique nor accidental. His account was precise and professional, the testimony of someone trained to observe and report without embellishment. When he finished, Agent Chen turned her attention to Vera. "Colonel Kowalski, your military background gives you a unique perspective on today's events. What's your assessment?" Vera had anticipated the question during their taxi to the operations center. "Ma'am, based on the radio traffic I monitored and the scope of the response, this appears to be coordinated electronic warfare targeting civilian aviation infrastructure. The precision required to simultaneously disrupt GPS, navigation beacons, and communication systems across multiple states suggests either foreign military capability or domestic actors with access to sophisticated equipment." Colonel Harrison leaned forward. "Foreign military, that's your assessment?" "It's one possibility," Vera replied carefully. "The alternative is that someone with intimate knowledge of our aviation infrastructure has the capability and motivation to conduct this kind of operation. Neither scenario is particularly comforting." Through the operations center's windows, the unusual collection of civilian aircraft continued growing as diversions arrived from across the eastern corridor. Each aircraft represented hundreds of passengers, whose normal Wednesday afternoon had become something unprecedented in American aviation history. Agent Chen made notes on a tablet while Colonel Harrison studied radar displays that showed the systematic reorganization of American airspace. Military aircraft maintained patrol patterns along the coasts, while civilian traffic flowed toward designated secure facilities. "Colonel Kowalski," Harrison said, "we're organizing experienced military pilots to assist with passenger interviews and technical assessments. Given your background and the fact that you were aboard one of the affected aircraft, would you be willing to extend your service temporarily?" Vera looked at Morrison and Jensen, then back at the displays showing the scope of the crisis. Retirement paperwork sat on a desk somewhere in Colorado, officially ending 23 years of military service. But service, she was learning, wasn't something that ended with paperwork. "Yes, sir," she replied. The temporary operations badge felt familiar against Vera's chest as she moved through McGuire's transformed passenger processing areas, where airline travelers found themselves subject to security procedures typically reserved for international border crossings. Military personnel conducted interviews with professional courtesy, while specialized equipment scanned luggage, electronics, and personal items for anything that might explain the coordinated attack on civilian aviation. Her first assignment involved interviewing passengers who had observed unusual activity during their flights, electronics malfunctioning beyond the norm, suspicious behavior from fellow travelers, or conversations overheard that might provide clues about the operation's scope and timing. The work required the patient attention to detail that separated competent intelligence gathering from merely going through motions. "Mrs. Patterson," Vera said, settling across from a middle-aged woman whose flight from Atlanta had experienced the same navigation failures at precisely 14:47 Eastern Time. "You mentioned that your laptop stopped working about 30 minutes before the pilot announced the navigation problems." "That's right," Mrs. Patterson replied, her hands fidgeting with a now-defunct smartphone. "I thought it was just a battery issue, But then other people started complaining about their devices too. Even the businessman next to me. His phone just went dead. Vera made notes while mentally calculating timelines. Coordinated electronic warfare typically began with broad-spectrum jamming before focusing on specific targets. If passenger electronics had failed 30 minutes before aviation systems, it suggested the attack had followed a deliberate progression designed to mask its true objectives. Similar interviews throughout the afternoon revealed a pattern consistent with sophisticated electronic warfare. Escalating system failures that began subtly before crescendoing into the complete disruption of civilian aviation. Each passenger's experience contributed another piece to a puzzle whose complete picture remained classified at levels above Vera's temporary access. By evening, the scope of the crisis had become clear through official channels and informal networks alike. Over 300 commercial flights had been diverted to military installations across the eastern United States. Similar operations were underway on the West Coast, suggesting the attack, for that's what intelligence assessments now officially termed it, had been continental in scope. Agent Chen found Vera reviewing passenger interview summaries in what had become an impromptu intelligence analysis center. "Colonel, we're getting reports of similar incidents in Europe and Asia. London Heathrow diverted everything to RAF stations. Tokyo had simultaneous GPS failures across their entire air traffic control system." The implications settled over Vera like the weight of a flight suit before a combat mission. This wasn't a regional attack or even a national one. It was global, coordinated, and sophisticated enough to suggest capabilities possessed by only a handful of actors on the world stage. "Any claims of responsibility?" she asked. "None yet, which is unusual for terrorism but consistent with state-level operations designed to probe response capabilities rather than claim credit." As night fell over McGuire Air Force Base, thousands of displaced passengers settled into temporary accommodations, while intelligence analysts worked to understand the day that would reshape global aviation security. Vera found herself once again in uniform, borrowed Air Force fatigues that fit well enough, serving her country in ways she hadn't anticipated when retirement papers were signed just days earlier. The temporary barracks assigned to displaced crew members felt familiar despite their military austerity. Metal bunks, institutional linens, and the peculiar quiet that comes when hundreds of people try to sleep in unfamiliar surroundings. Vera lay awake listening to the sounds of Morrison's steady breathing from the next bunk and the distant rumble of military aircraft maintaining security patrols in the darkness above. Her smartphone, now functional again after whatever had caused the widespread electronics failures, displayed a cascade of missed calls and messages from family members who'd seen news reports about the aviation crisis. The messages revealed the civilian perspective on events she'd experienced from the inside: confusion, concern, and the gradual realization that something unprecedented had occurred in American airspace. A text from her sister in Denver captured the broader anxiety. "Vera, are you okay? They're saying all the planes were forced to land. Was this terrorism? Please call when you can." The question of terrorism versus state-sponsored action would likely occupy intelligence analysts for weeks as they sifted through electronic signatures, timing patterns, and the sophisticated coordination required to simultaneously disrupt aviation systems across multiple continents. Vera's pilot instincts suggested the latter. The precision and scope indicated military-level planning and capabilities that exceeded typical terrorist organizations. At 300 hours, her thoughts were interrupted by the quiet approach of Captain Torres, whose presence at this hour suggested either insomnia or official business. "Colonel," he whispered, "Colonel Harrison requests your presence in the operations center. Something's developed." The nighttime operations center hummed with the subdued energy of crisis management in its analysis phase. Screens displayed global flight tracking data, showing the systematic restoration of civilian aviation as airports gradually return to normal operations. But overlaying the routine patterns were new elements: military aircraft maintaining patrol positions and unusual gaps in coverage that suggested ongoing security concerns. Colonel Harrison stood before a large display showing radar tracks from the previous afternoon, each civilian aircraft's path color-coded by time and deviation from planned routes. The pattern that emerged was both elegant and terrifying in its precision, a coordinated operation that had temporarily paralyzed civilian aviation across 3 continents with timing accurate to within minutes. "Colonel Kowalski," Harrison said without preamble, "we've received a request from Pentagon Operations. They're forming a task force to analyze this incident and develop countermeasures. Your combination of combat experience and first-hand observation of today's events makes you particularly valuable to their assessment." Agent Chen stood beside a communication station where encrypted messages continued arriving from intelligence services around the world. "The initial assessment confirms our worst fears," she said. "This was a demonstration, a proof of concept showing that civilian aviation infrastructure remains vulnerable to coordinated electronic warfare." Vieira studied the displays while processing the implications. If today had been a demonstration rather than an attack, it suggested the actors possessed even greater capabilities than they'd revealed. "What's the Pentagon's assessment of probable actors?" she asked. "Classified above our access level," Harrison replied, "but the sophistication and coordination point toward nation-state capabilities." Through the Operations Center windows, dawn was beginning to break over McGuire Air Force Base, revealing the unusual collection of civilian aircraft that marked yesterday's crisis like monuments to vulnerability in an interconnected world. The Pentagon's task force convened in a secured conference room that bore the sterile efficiency of spaces designed for classified discussions. Vera found herself seated among a collection of military and civilian experts whose combined experience spanned decades of aviation security, electronic warfare, and intelligence analysis. Her temporary security clearance granted access to information that painted yesterday's events in even starker terms. General Patricia Hawkins, a career Air Force officer whose Silver Stars commanded immediate attention, presided over briefings that revealed the true scope of what media outlets were calling Aviation Wednesday. The simultaneous disruption of civilian aviation infrastructure had been accomplished through coordinated attacks on satellite navigation systems, ground-based navigation beacons, and communication networks with timing precision that suggested months of preparation. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hawkins began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades thinking about America's vulnerabilities, "what we witnessed yesterday was the equivalent of a cyber Pearl Harbor for civilian aviation. The actors demonstrated the ability to simultaneously paralyze air transportation across multiple continents without firing a shot or detonating a single explosive device." Satellite imagery displayed on the briefing room's main screen showed the global impact. Airports from London to Tokyo, where diverted aircraft had created unprecedented congestion. Military bases transformed overnight into civilian processing centers, and the careful choreography of air traffic control systems struggling to maintain order during coordinated failure of their primary navigation tools. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, a civilian contractor whose expertise in electronic warfare had shaped American defensive capabilities for 2 decades, provided technical analysis that confirmed Vieira's initial assessment. The precision required to simultaneously disrupt GPS satellites, VOR navigation beacons, and aircraft communication systems indicates either foreign military capability or domestic actors with access to classified information about our infrastructure vulnerabilities. The implications rippled through the room like shock waves from a distant explosion. If foreign military forces possess the capability to paralyze American aviation at will, the strategic balance that had maintained global stability for decades had shifted fundamentally. If domestic actors were responsible, the breach of security was even more troubling. Colonel James Patterson, whose career in Air Force intelligence had involved tracking exactly these kinds of threats, displayed communication intercepts that had been gathered during the crisis. We recorded unusual radio traffic on military frequencies beginning approximately 6 hours before the first civilian systems failed. The transmissions were encrypted using methodologies consistent with advanced military communication systems. Vera studied the technical displays while drawing on her combat experience with electronic warfare environments. During operations over Iraq and Afghanistan, she'd flown missions where enemy forces attempted to jam American communication and navigation systems. The sophistication required for yesterday's operation exceeded anything she'd encountered in combat zones. "General," she said, "if I may ask, what's the current assessment of our vulnerability to repeat attacks?" General Hawkins exchanged glances with Dr. Reeves before responding. "Colonel Kowalski, that's precisely why this task force exists. We need to understand not just what happened, but how to prevent it from happening again." The briefing continued with technical analysis that revealed layer after layer of American aviation, infrastructure's dependence on systems that had been designed for efficiency rather than security. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Pentagon's classified corridors, the task force's initial findings painted a picture of vulnerability that extended far beyond aviation. The coordinated attack on civilian air transportation had revealed systemic weaknesses in America's critical infrastructure that could be exploited by any actor with sufficient technical capability and strategic patience. Vera found herself assigned to a working group focused on developing rapid response protocols for future incidents. The assignment drew heavily on her combat experience, where split-second decisions often meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But the scale of potential future attacks dwarfed anything she'd encountered in fighter aircraft over hostile territory. "The fundamental problem," explained Dr. Reeves during a smaller working group session, "is that our civilian aviation infrastructure was designed assuming benevolent actors and cooperative international systems. GPS satellites, navigation beacons, and communication networks all operate on the principle of open access and mutual benefit." Colonel Patterson nodded grimly. "Which makes them inherently vulnerable to anyone willing to exploit that openness for hostile purposes." The technical discussions that followed revealed the elegant simplicity of yesterday's attack. Rather than physically destroying infrastructure, the actors had simply overwhelmed key systems with sophisticated jamming that rendered them temporarily useless. The effect was complete paralysis without permanent damage, a demonstration of capability rather than an attempt at destruction. Vera's military experience provided context for the strategic thinking behind such an operation. "In combat terms, this was a reconnaissance in force," she observed. "They wanted to test our response capabilities and measure our vulnerability without triggering the kind of retaliation that actual destruction would provoke." The working group's preliminary recommendations focused on hardening civilian aviation systems against electronic warfare attacks while developing protocols for maintaining flight safety when primary navigation systems failed. The technical challenges were immense, requiring coordination between military and civilian agencies that historically operated independently. As evening approached, General Hawkins reconvened the full task force for preliminary briefings that would inform initial recommendations to senior leadership. The day's analysis had revealed that America's aviation infrastructure remained vulnerable to repeat attacks, and the actors who had demonstrated their capability on aviation Wednesday retained the ability to paralyze civilian air transportation whenever they chose to do so. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general said as classified documents were secured and participants prepared to return to their respective agencies. "What we've learned today is that the rules of the game have changed. Aviation security can no longer assume that our primary threats come from explosive devices or hijackers. We're facing actors with the capability to attack our infrastructure without setting foot on American soil. The implications would reshape American aviation security for decades to come. But for Vera, the immediate concern was more personal. Her retirement from military service had lasted exactly 1 week before duty called her back to defend her country in ways she'd never anticipated. The secure communication facility at the Pentagon buzzed with encrypted transmissions, connecting American defense officials with counterparts across the globe, painting a picture of international cooperation in the face of unprecedented threats to civilian aviation. Vera found herself participating in video conferences with military and intelligence officials from allied nations, each sharing pieces of a puzzle whose complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. "Colonel Kowalski," came the voice of Squadron Leader Davies from RAF Mildenhall, "our analysis suggests the electronic warfare signatures match patterns we observed during recent exercises with NATO partners. The concern is that someone may have been monitoring our training operations to develop countermeasures." The possibility that Allied training exercises had been compromised added another layer of complexity to an already intricate intelligence picture. NATO's defensive preparations, designed to strengthen collective security, may have inadvertently provided hostile actors with detailed information about alliance capabilities and vulnerabilities. French Colonel Dubois, participating from the Joint Electronic Warfare Center in Rennes, contributed technical analysis that confirmed similar conclusions. The sophistication of the jamming patterns suggests not just knowledge of our systems, but understanding of our standard operating procedures for responding to electronic warfare attacks. Vera absorbed the international perspectives while considering her own observations from Aviation Wednesday. The precision with which civilian systems had failed suggested detailed reconnaissance of American aviation infrastructure, possibly conducted over months or years of patient intelligence gathering. Dr. Reeves, who had remained in the Pentagon for the international coordination sessions, displayed analysis comparing electronic signatures from the aviation attack with patterns detected during previous incidents that had been attributed to state-level actors. The correlations were disturbing but not conclusive, sophisticated enough to suggest common origins, but subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability. "The challenge we face," she explained to the international participants, "is that electronic warfare attacks leave fewer forensic traces than conventional weapons. Attribution requires